Have you ever heard of a war so brief, so absurdly short that it ended before most people had even finished their breakfast? A war not measured in years, not even in days, but in mere minutes. 38 minutes. That's all it took for one side's empire to thunder across the world stage, and for another nation's sovereignty to be reduced to rubble. Today, we journey back to August 27, 1896, to witness the almost unbelievable story of the Anglo-Zanzibar War, the shortest war in recorded history. But this isn't just a quirky historical fact. It's a tale of arrogance, power, betrayal, and the brutal speed with which empires could crush resistance at the height of the colonial era. Stay with me until the end, because this is not the story you think it is. By the late 19th century, the world had been carved up by European powers in what history remembers as the scramble for Africa. Across the continent, European nations planted their flags, drew borders with straight rulers, and claimed dominion over lands and peoples they scarcely understood. Britain was at the very peak of its empire, the so-called empire on which the sun never sets. Its navy patrolled every ocean, its colonies stretched across continents, and its diplomats wielded power like kings. Meanwhile, Zanzibar, a small island off the coast of East Africa in the warm waters of the Indian Ocean, had long been a jewel in the spice trade. Its clove plantations brought immense wealth, and its location made it a strategic gateway to the African mainland. But Zanzibar was no European colony, not yet. It was ruled by its own sultans, descended from the Omani dynasty. The island was rich, cosmopolitan, and deeply entangled in global trade networks. And crucially, Britain had interests there. Interests it intended to protect at any cost.
By the 1890s, Zanzibar's sultans were more figureheads than absolute monarchs. British advisors lurked in every corner of government. Treaties had been signed that gave Britain the final say over trade and diplomacy, and the Royal Navy was always a shadow on the horizon, a reminder of who really held power. The reigning sultan in the early 1890s, Sultan Hamad bin Fawaiini, was seen as compliant, a man who tolerated British influence. Under him, the island lived in relative peace, albeit under the heavy presence of the Union Jack. But in the palace corridors, not everyone was content. Ambition simmered, waiting for the right moment. On August 25, 1896, Zanzibar was shaken by sudden news. Sultan Hamad was dead. The official story was that he had died of natural causes, but whispers spread quickly through the city that he had been poisoned by his cousin Khalid bin Bargash, who wasted no time in seizing the palace. Within hours, Khalid declared himself the new Sultan of Zanzibar. But there was a problem, a very big problem. You see, Khalid had not been the candidate approved by the British. Britain already had a preferred successor, Hamoud bin Mohammed, a man far more pliable to their control. So when Khalid locked himself inside the palace, gathered his supporters, and raised the Sultan's flag, Britain saw it not as a coronation, but as a rebellion. The British consul on the island, Basil Cave, was a seasoned diplomat. He knew that Britain could not and would not tolerate a sultan who might challenge their dominance. Immediately, Cave sent word to Khalid: step down, leave the palace, or face the consequences. But Khalid refused. Instead, he fortified the palace, called on his loyal guards, and assembled an army of nearly 3,000 men. He even dragged out a few antiquated artillery pieces, placing them defiantly on the palace grounds. He was daring Britain to act. And act they would. Anchored in Zanzibar's harbor were several British warships. Among them were HMS St. George, HMS Raccoon, HMS Thrush, and HMS Sparrow. Together, they represented overwhelming firepower, naval guns that could level the ornate palace in minutes. Reinforcements were quickly summoned. The Union Jack fluttered on masts, and sailors prepared their cannons. The message was clear. This was no negotiation. It was an ultimatum backed by steel and gunpowder. On the evening of August 26, 1896, Basil Cave delivered Britain's final message to Khalid. He must vacate the palace by 9 a.m. the next morning, August 27th. If not, the British ships would open fire. Khalid believed he could bluff his way through. He was convinced the British would not dare to destroy the Palace of Zanzibar, a place of beauty and diplomacy in the heart of the island's capital. He was wrong. As the sun set that night, the streets of Zanzibar City buzzed with tension. Merchants shuttered their shops, families huddled in their homes. Soldiers paced nervously by the palace walls. The world's shortest war was only hours away. And so the stage was set. On the morning of August 27, 1896, as the tropical sun rose over the Indian Ocean, the clock began to tick toward a deadline that would make history. Would Khalid step down and preserve his throne? Would Britain hesitate to unleash its firepower on such a small island? Or would the clash between an empire and a defiant sultan ignite in thunder and smoke? The answer came in just 38 minutes.
At dawn, the harbor of Zanzibar City was thick with tension. The air was heavy, the streets silent, as if the entire island was holding its breath. By 8 a.m., the Royal Navy's warships had taken their positions. Gun crews stood ready at their stations. Officers paced the decks, watches in hand, waiting for the moment of truth. Inside the palace, Sultan Khalid's men braced for a fight. 3,000 soldiers filled the grounds, many armed with little more than muskets and spears. A few ancient cannons, relics from another era, were aimed at the harbor, their iron barrels pointed toward British ships bristling with modern naval guns. The contrast could not have been starker. One side with obsolete weapons and raw courage, the other with industrial-era steel and overwhelming firepower. At 8:55 a.m., a messenger from the British consul Basil Cave delivered the final ultimatum. Khalid had 5 minutes to surrender. The Sultan's response was silence. He would not abdicate. Instead, he ordered his men to hold their ground and prepare to defend the palace at all costs. On the decks of HMS St. George, the flagship of the British squadron, Admiral Harry Rawson raised his hand. He gave the signal. If the palace flag was still flying by 9 a.m., the guns would speak. The clock struck 9. The Sultan's red flag still fluttered defiantly over the palace. Admiral Rawson nodded. A thunderous boom split the air as the first shell roared from HMS St. George. It arced across the harbor and slammed into the palace walls with devastating force. In an instant, the world's shortest war had begun. For the next 38 minutes, Zanzibar City shook under the fury of British guns. The ornate palace, with its carved balconies and shining domes, crumbled under the relentless bombardment. Cannon after cannon thundered from the decks of British warships, their shells tearing holes in the palace walls, shattering towers, and igniting fires that raged through the wooden beams. Inside, chaos reigned. Khalid's soldiers scrambled for cover, firing wildly toward the harbor with muskets and old cannon fire that barely reached the British ships. Their return volleys were hopelessly ineffective. Balls splashed into the sea or clanged harmlessly off the armored hulls of the Royal Navy. The defenders fought bravely, but it was like throwing pebbles at a hurricane. As the bombardment intensified, smoke choked the palace corridors. Flames licked through the windows. The once proud seat of Zanzibar's power was being reduced to rubble before its people's eyes. Khalid himself, realizing the hopelessness of his position, slipped out through a back door, abandoning his men. Shielded by loyal followers, he fled across the city, eventually seeking refuge at the German consulate. His soldiers left behind had no such escape. Some fought on desperately. Others threw down their weapons. Still others died where they stood, consumed by the storm of fire. The British weren't content with destroying the palace. Their naval guns also targeted the Sultan's small fleet moored in the harbor. Among them was the royal yacht HTHS Glasgow, once the pride of Zanzibar's navy. Within minutes of shelling, the vessel was ablaze.
its masts crashing into the sea as flames engulfed the deck. Sailors leapt overboard, struggling in the water as burning debris rained around them. By the time the smoke cleared, the Sultan's entire naval presence, 3 vessels in total, had been sunk or captured. The Navy of Zanzibar ceased to exist in less than half an hour.
By 9:38 a.m., just 38 minutes after the first shot was fired, the battle was over. The palace was in ruins, its once glorious walls reduced to blackened rubble. The Sultan's flag had been shot down. Fires burned unchecked, sending plumes of smoke curling into the morning sky. The defenders had suffered catastrophic losses. More than 500 men lay dead or wounded, their blood staining the palace grounds. On the British side, just 1 sailor wounded, and that from a stray rifle shot. The imbalance was staggering. It was not a battle, it was an annihilation. As the guns fell silent, British Marines and sailors stormed ashore. They marched into the smoldering ruins, securing the palace and restoring order with swift efficiency. The once proud soldiers of Khalid were disarmed. Prisoners were rounded up. Civilians, terrified and dazed, wandered through the smoke-filled streets, trying to make sense of the destruction they had just witnessed. And as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The Anglo-Zanzibar War, the shortest war in recorded history, had lasted just 38 minutes. But this was not the end of Zanzibar's story. The war may have lasted less than an hour, but its consequences would echo for decades. Who replaced Khalid? How did Britain tighten its grip on the island after the bombardment? And what became of the defiant Sultan who had dared to challenge an empire? All of that awaits in Part 3, The Aftermath and Legacy. When the last echo of cannon fire faded across the harbor, the Palace of Zanzibar was no more than a smoking ruin. Where once stood whitewashed walls and carved archways, there now lay heaps of shattered stone and charred timbers. The heart of the Sultanate had been ripped out in less than an hour. For the people of Zanzibar City, the war had not just destroyed a building, it had destroyed a symbol. The palace was more than a royal residence. It was the visible face of their sovereignty, their heritage, their pride. Now, it was rubble beneath British guns. The numbers told a story as shocking as the destruction itself. Over 500 Zanzibari defenders were killed or wounded. Many of these men had fought with outdated muskets, others with nothing but courage. Their sacrifice was tragic, their resistance futile. In contrast, Britain reported only a single wounded sailor, 1 man grazed by a rifle bullet. The imbalance was staggering, a chilling reminder of how industrial power had tilted the scales of war beyond recognition. This was not a clash of equals. It was the crushing of a small state by the overwhelming weight of empire. And what of the man at the center of it all? Sultan Khalid, the would-be ruler who had dared to defy Britain, had not fallen with his palace. As the shells tore through the walls, Khalid slipped away through a back exit, abandoning his men and fleeing through the city streets. Guarded by a loyal few, he reached the German consulate, where he threw himself on their protection. The Germans, eager to needle Britain, granted him asylum. And so, while his supporters lay dead in the ruins of the palace, Khalid sat in safety beneath the black, white, and red flag of the German Empire. The British demanded his surrender. The Germans refused. Diplomats exchanged sharp words, but neither side was willing to risk open conflict over a deposed sultan. Khalid would remain under German protection until, years later, he was quietly exiled. His brief, disastrous reign ended not with glory, but with flight and humiliation.
In Khalid's place, the British installed Hamoud bin Mohammed. Unlike Khalid, Hamoud had no illusions of independence. He was Britain's man through and through, willing to govern in line with their interests. His coronation was less the triumph of a local ruler than the official stamp of British supremacy. From that moment onward, Zanzibar ceased to be a truly independent state. It was a protectorate in all but name, its sultan a ceremonial figure whose throne rested on the will of the Union Jack. Ironically, one of Hamoud's first acts under British direction was the abolition of slavery. For centuries, Zanzibar had been a hub of the East African slave trade. Thousands of men, women, and children were bought and sold in its markets, carried across the Indian Ocean in chains. Under pressure from Britain, which by the late 19th century had positioned itself as the global enforcer of anti-slavery measures, Hamoud issued decrees outlawing slavery on the island. It was a dramatic shift, reshaping Zanzibari society and economy forever. Yet even this act, noble as it might appear, was driven less by humanitarian ideals than by Britain's desire to tighten its grip on the region. Abolition became another lever of imperial control. The Anglo-Zanzibar War was more than just a local skirmish. It was a message. Britain was making an example out of Khalid, sending a clear warning to anyone who might dream of resisting its authority. The message was simple: resistance was futile. The empire could and would crush defiance in less time than it took to brew a pot of tea. Across the globe, colonial powers watched and understood. The war may have been short, but its symbolism was long-lasting. For the people of Zanzibar, the scars ran deep. The ruins of the palace stood as a reminder of that morning in August 1896, when imperial firepower reduced their sovereignty to ash. Even today, the Anglo-Zanzibar War is remembered not for its scale, but for its brevity. A footnote in global history, often recited as a trivia fact. Did you know the shortest war in history lasted only 38 minutes? But behind that trivia lies a sobering truth. It was not a game, nor a curiosity. It was a moment of violence, loss, and domination. Lives were lost, a nation's pride was shattered, and an empire grew ever more entrenched in its arrogance. And so the war ended almost as soon as it had begun. 38 minutes of cannon fire reshaped Zanzibar's destiny, pulling it firmly into the orbit of the British Empire. But the story does not end here, because hidden in those 38 minutes are lessons about empire, about power, about how quickly history can turn. In our final part, we will bring together everything we've seen, the causes, the battle, the aftermath, and the meaning of it all. And we'll close with a reflection on why this shortest war in history is more than just a historical oddity. It's a mirror of the world we still live in today. And so, the Anglo-Zanzibar War ended in less than the time it takes to watch a single episode of your favorite series. 38 minutes. A war so short, so lopsided, that it has often been treated as a punchline in history books. But when we peel back the trivia, when we look beyond the brevity, we see the full weight of what those minutes meant. It was not just a small island against a great empire. It was the story of colonial domination. It was the crushing of defiance under the boots of imperial power. It was the collision of pride, ambition, and the unstoppable momentum of the industrial age. Why does this story matter today? Because it reminds us that history isn't always measured in years or decades. Sometimes, the turning point of a nation can be decided in less than an hour. For Zanzibar, 38 minutes changed everything. It lost not just a palace, not just lives, but its independence. From that day on, the island was locked into Britain's orbit, its sultans little more than ceremonial figures under imperial command. For Britain, the war was a demonstration of supremacy. It showcased the terrifying efficiency of modern firepower, and it warned others across the empire of what awaited those who resisted.
And for us, as students of history, it is a reminder of how uneven the scales of power can be. Courage and determination may fill the hearts of men, but against industrial cannons and battleships, they can be swept aside in minutes. History often judges its figures not by their intentions, but by their outcomes. Khalid bin Barghash is remembered not as a bold sultan, but as the man who triggered the shortest war in history and fled into exile. His defiance, though dramatic, ended in ashes. Hamoud bin Mohammed, the British-backed sultan, became the ruler who oversaw the end of slavery in Zanzibar, but also the ruler who surrendered his nation's autonomy to foreign hands. He was hailed as a reformer, yet history remembers him as a puppet of empire. Together, their legacies remind us that in the game of imperial politics, even rulers were pawns. The Anglo-Zanzibar War was just one episode in a much larger story, the story of Africa under European imperialism. Across the continent, borders were drawn by foreign powers, resources were extracted, and sovereignty was stripped away. Zanzibar's 38 minutes of resistance stand as a symbol of how swiftly and brutally that domination could be enforced. 38 minutes, less than the length of a school class, less than half a football match. But in those 38 minutes, lives were lost, sovereignty was destroyed, and the might of an empire was displayed for all to see. It is a story that forces us to think about power. Who has it, who doesn't, and how quickly it can be taken away. And it is a story that should remind us that behind every statistic, behind every trivia fact, are real people. Soldiers who fought, families who fled, leaders who gambled and lost. If you've been captivated by this story of the shortest war in history, then you'll want to explore another tale of resistance, one that could not be more different. Because while Zanzibar's defenders crumbled in less than an hour, another group of warriors, the Spartans at Thermopylae, stood against overwhelming odds for 3 days, shaping legend itself. On my channel, Secrets of History, you can watch my full video on the Battle of Thermopylae, 300 Spartans versus Persia. Click on the end screen right here and step from the shortest war to one of the most legendary last stands in history. And before you go, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think? Should Khalid be remembered as a reckless gambler who doomed his people, or as a tragic symbol of resistance crushed by empire? Let's discuss it in the comments below. If you've enjoyed this journey through time, don't forget to like this video, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe to my channel, Secrets of History, for more epic tales from the past. History is full of secrets, and together we're here to uncover them all.